My name is Rawiri Waretini-Karena, and this is my presentation, Taki Toru from Parallel to Partnership. It's a ritual of engagement based on Te Tiriti o Waitangi for safe cross-cultural practice of Māori counselling and social science. So the rationale for this framework which I've developed is about supporting our Māori counselling students to engage with Māori, to establish relationships, to advocate, to mediate. Ultimate goal is about utilising Te Tiriti o Waitangi for building interrelationships, and that they can begin to understand how colonisation shaped cultural safety. So the main objective is to develop degree graduates who are culturally safe practitioners, they have a firm knowledge of historical contexts, they're able to articulate their Indigenous position utilising Western theories, Western terminologies, as well as Kupapa Māori theories. So why is it important? A significant percentage of Māori utilise social services. The majority of social services are run by Pākehā agencies. As a result, there are misunderstandings and different worldviews and polarities of thinking. So what this model talks about is that we have two stakeholders here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what it asks is, how do we come into shared space, yet still keep our mana, our integrity, our dignity, our autonomy? So it asks, how do we create that shared space? So what I'm going to do is introduce to you, what is Taki Toru? So Taki Toru is a tukutuku pattern. It supports our carvings, our whakairo, and our kōwhaiwhai patterns to tell the pūrākau, to tell the story, the histories of the people of that land. And all of that resides in our wharenui. I utilise this pattern in particular. This is Roimata Taki Toru. It has three main features. The first one talks about the tears that flow for those who have passed. The second part talks about the ahi ka that moves from one generation to the next. And the next part talks about communication, the way that we communicate, the way that we interrelate, the way that we interact. And it's based on whakawhanaungatanga. So whakawhanaungatanga is, we know it to be a ritual of engagement that we traditionally utilise in our pōwhiri. Mason Jury says that a pōwhiri is an encounter calculated to reduce space and distance between groups and to explore the basis of a relationship. So what is safe cultural practice? Robin Williams said it's an environment which is safe for people where there's no assault, challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. It's about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience of learning together with dignity but truly listening. So what our students do, they learn examples of culturally safe practice. They have to learn the appropriate protocols to engage with Māori. They have to learn how to create a rapport in a culturally appropriate manner. They have to learn how to establish a relationship using appropriate language. How to be sensitive, respectful, non-judgmental, non-interpretive and non-directive. They also need to learn to understand the historical colonial context that created an unequal power base. This is my friend, Dr. Taima Moika-Pickering, and she said by training professionals to learn about racism, they would then be equipped to practice in a culturally appropriate way. She says that the cultural safety example is one model that works towards unlearning racist practices. So in terms of setting the basis of the Taki Toru framework, I looked at one of Marie Bretti's quotes. She says that educators must reject colonial curricula that offer students a fragmented and distorted picture of Indigenous peoples and offer students a critical perspective of the historical context that created the fragmentation. So I'm in a position where I'm a lecturer for Te Whiwhi o Tau Māori Counselling. Since 1991, the program has been situated in the Māori department. In 2008, they closed that department, and then we got moved to a mainstream environment. And what's actually happened as a result of that, I've been battling mainstream counselling, mainstream social work, mental health. And we got to a stage where we kind of got into shared space, and so we started having conversations of treaty partnership conversations, and what would it look like in shared space for us. And so, as part of that conversation, I started looking at three specific areas, and that is safe cultural practice, te tiriti o Waitangi, and professional clinical practice. And then where we went from there is one of the things that my students always get asked is, so what Western models do you know? My students, we work first and foremost from Māori models. We never used to worry about the Western models because for us it didn't work for our people. But now we learn the models and the theories, and well, there's a reason behind that. But we focus on two types of analysis. One is critical analysis and holistic analysis. So we utilise our critical analysis to work with conflict theories and conflict theorists, and to work with conscientisation theories and conscientisation theorists. You know, we listen to people like Vivian Burr, Karl Marx, you know, all those people, they talk about all the problems that happen in society. But what I really noticed is that none of them have an Indigenous context. And so when I sit with my mainstream counselling counterparts and the mainstream social work counterparts, they're very, very knowledgeable in terms of those theories and those theorists. But one thing that we can do is that we pull them into decolonising theories and decolonising theorists. And then we pull them into kaupapa Māori theories and kaupapa Māori theorists. What they actually find is they don't have a footing. They can't speak in that realm. But what we actually do is we move them from conflict theories, conscientisation theories, decolonising theories, kaupapa Māori theories. Those are good, but what happens, our whānau they stay in that hara. So what's most important for us is transformative theories and transformative theorists. And people like Fenton, Memi, Rawiri have been really supportive, Tuhi Wai Smith. Yeah. But what it's actually done is it's given our own students a broader scope in terms of theories and theorists. So because Te Tiriti o Waitangi is an important part of this framework, we're going to go into that right now. So the preamble says it was about securing our tino rangatiratanga, our self-determination. It was about securing our Māori land ownership. So Te Tiriti o Waitangi 1840 was signed between Governor Hobson of the British Empire and 500 Māori chiefs. Article 1, Māori give to the Queen of England the right to have a governor in New Zealand. Article 2, the Queen agrees that Māori keep their independence and control over their lands and everything that is important to them. Article 3, the Queen give to Māori people the same rights as British people. Article 4, the Queen promises to protect Māori customs and the different religions in New Zealand. So, what this model highlights is, this is what we agreed to share, this is what we agreed to keep. So we agreed to have a governor in New Zealand, but not one that governed over us. We agreed to the rights of British people, we agreed to trade and technology, we agreed that we would share our land and resources. But we also agreed that we were going to keep our sovereignty, our customary native title, all the lands that were designated for Māori, our customs, our beliefs, and our culture. So, this is what we agreed, and this is what happened. Legislation was utilised to attack us in 3 different areas. Our lands and our resources. They blocked all forms of redress and accountability. They used legislation to simulate and subjugate our culture, our language, and our identity. I believe one of my friends, Dr. Rawiri, he summed it up pretty clearly. He stated that Māori face systematic, economic, political, social, and cultural marginalisation, cultural alienation, forced assimilation, demonisation, racism, structural prejudice, and intergenerational impoverishment. Māori language was banned, culture and heritage decimated. The number of speakers of the Māori language declined from 95% in 1900 to 5% in 1980. Now, from just looking at these different contexts, what I've done is, these are some of the exercises that I've put together, and I take my students on a journey of rediscovery. Our first year is called Ko Waio, Ko Wai Koe, so they have to go and they have to go and find their identity. What I'll do is I'm going to go through this, but for the benefit of this presentation, I'll just show you how this works. So, from a historical context, I had to ask myself, what do these violations mean to me? I have to say it meant nothing at all. It was so far in my history, I hadn't made the connection from my historical context to my personal context. But from a societal context, I have to ask myself, how come Māori are overrepresented in some of the biggest deficit statistics in New Zealand society? I also ask myself from an institutional perspective, how come other ethnic cultures get better access to resources, health and education than Māori do? But what really hit me is I had to ask myself from a personal perspective, what did the Treaty of Waitangi violations mean to me? And I have to be honest and say it actually meant nothing. It meant nothing at all. And there was a big reason for this. It's because I didn't know who I was. I didn't know my identity. I didn't know my language. I didn't know my culture. So what I had to do was go on my own discovery, go on my own journal. And so what I did was I heard the word pūrākau. And that's something that I utilised. So I went back through my family, went back through 4 generations, and I looked at their stories from 1840. And then I took those Treaty of Waitangi violations and I superimposed them over 4 generations of my family. And for the first time, stories began to emerge. Things that I never ever thought about before. And things became really, really clear for me. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of that story. These are some of the exercises that I take my own students through. So I found this photo. It was taken in 1893. In the middle is a Pākehā gentleman. He's the Prime Minister of New Zealand. His name is Richard Seddon. Beside him is the third Māori king, King Mahuta. And beside him is my great-grandfather, Te Nahu Te Kuri, Waretini-Wetini. So I'm going to share a little bit of their pūrākau. So my great-grandfather was born in 1840. He fought for the kingitanga in the Waikato invasion against the British Empire in 1863. He was 23 years old. He was exiled into the King Country with King Tāwhiao. He fought alongside Iwi Manapoto at Ōrākau Pā. In his older years, he became the spiritual advisor to King Mahuta, King Te Rata, and Princess Tupuia. He died in 1940. My grandfather was born in 1920. He was brought up by Princess Tupuia. He helped build Tūrango Waiwai Marae. He spoke Māori, but he was scrapped in school for doing so. He ended up fighting in World War II. He moved away from Māori culture for Western religion. To this date, none of his children speak Māori or know Māori culture. 1946, my father was born. He wasn't brought up around the culture, urbanised Māori, the pepper potting system, so he undervalued anything that was Māori. He put his friends and his family before his family. He beat and abused his wife and his children. He wasn't taught any principles or any values, so he didn't instill them into his own children. I call them the once were warriors generation. And then I come down to me. I grew up with no identity. I didn't know my native language or culture. I was brought up by the state. I was taken away from my family when I was 5 years old. I was brought up in family homes, foster homes, social welfare homes, boys' homes, hostel, and prison. So what I actually did, I had to do a lot of research and probably healing of self. So Daniel Campbell says that the psychology of oppression is a process of mental, physical and spiritual conditioning or reconditioning that strikes at the very seed and growth process of the inner self. Eventually, an aura of self-loathing and learned helplessness becomes the norm of negative developmental thought and self-perception. This is contextualizing symptoms of historical intergenerational trauma through a genealogy. So I was really listening. I was listening to what the fire was saying before. So I thought I would share the state because I've got something for you. And so what it actually highlights is some examples of historical intergenerational trauma that filter from generation to generation to generation. I have to say that I knew about this in my family, but I didn't have a clue as to where it all came from. And it wasn't until I went on that journey back through the Treaty of Waitangi violations, then I connected all the dots and the jigsaw puzzle started to come together. And then I began to understand for myself. So this is from Waretini-Karena, and he said the native idea of historical trauma involves an understanding that the trauma occurred in the spirit or the soul. What I recognized is that now that I know what I knew, what am I going to do about it? And so again, I need to go on a transforming journey for myself. And so I ended up developing a model, and it looks something like this. And so step one asks to describe what it's like to move from having no knowledge of the cultural history to gaining knowledge of cultural history. Then step three asks, describe the impact of learning about the environment of their ancestors, that their ancestors lived in, and what it has had on them personally. I tell my students, I want you to learn the history of your people. I want you to walk in their shoes so that you can understand. I have had corridor in the past where my students says they gave up. I say, you can't say that. You don't understand their environment. Go and research. And I asked them that if they were, in step forward, I asked them if you were to begin to remove the chains of colonization from within yourself and to reclaim your indigenousness, what will that look like? And as we're in an academic round, I also asked them, why is it important for a Māori counsellor to learn Western theories? And I also asked them, now that you know what you know, how would you be more proactive with Indigenous issues? And then finally I asked them, how would you use this process to transform yourself, your family, and your community? So I say, by acknowledging the relationship needs to be re-established from a position founded on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And that's what will bring all the stakeholders back together. Why? Because those are the roles that were set right from the very beginning. Under our current relationship, what it highlights is that there's no trust, there's no connections. So it says, so how do we bring them all together again? This is a model that was created by Dr. Janet Helms in America. And what I did, I took that concept, or I actually developed the model in the diagram. Hers was, but I wanted to create it from Aotearoa. And what it highlights is that two divergent cultures who go off on their own journey of rediscovery, and then they come back into shared space. I call it ki te pō, ki te ao marama. So they move from the darkness into the light, and they gain an integrative awareness of each other. So Kākano Rua talks about biculturalism. So at first we all want to be Kiwis, we all want to get along. But then we go off on this journey because Māori begin to realise, hey, there are two versions to the story. The official one that says that we can be anything that we want to be, and the grassroots version which says because of what we look like, because of what we represent, those are barriers to any opportunities that may come. Then you got over the Pākehā side, they tautoko, they say, hey, yes, we understand what happened to you historically was wrong. However, why don't you just get over it? The Māori move on another journey, kei te he. They begin to see the injustices, they get angry at Pākehā, they want to conform to their own ethnic culture, so they feel comfortable with their own people. Whereas over the Pākehā on the other side there, I call it, they move from agreeing to resisting. They say there's a new form of racism, and it's racism against Pākehā, also known as reverse racism. In step 5 it says, which is maramatanga, they become enlightened. So they realise that there are issues in Māori culture as well, due to the impact of colonisation. But they begin to realise that not all Pākehā are bad. And then in actual fact it's the perception of racism itself. Once you can look at it, then that can be challenged. Then you've got kauri to retreat. Pākehā begin to recognise that, when they begin to recognise that perceptions about Māori are false, they begin to retreat themselves. They begin to feel guilty about the impacts of colonisation. And sometimes they even argue against other Pākehā who just don't get it. We've got step 7, tino rangatiratanga. So Māori begin to rediscover their cultural heritage, and they define for themselves what it is to be Māori. And Puake, on the Pākehā side, they begin to understand what is white privilege, and they begin to understand how they continue to benefit from it. But then they take control of their lives, and they begin to take control over the type of treaty partner they want to be. And when they all meet in that position, then we can come into shared space. And it's about both parties coming, sharing our understanding of the issues, working collaboratively to create a more inclusive society, recognising that it's the economic system that impacts on both cultures. Both cultures positively identify with their racial group, while also acknowledging that other aspects of their identity continue to contribute to their humanity in meaningful ways. So at the end of the day, it's about developing effective Māori counselling and social science students who are cross-culturally professional in their practice, cross-culturally clinical in their competence, and cross-culturally flexible in their approachability and sensitivity when dealing with Māori in shared space. So to conclude, what we have here is a whare. And we recognise that we are two main cultures who live in this whare. The question that I ask is this: so how do we create that shared space? How do we create that the equilibrium? Down the bottom there's a saying from the second Māori king, Tāwhiao Te Wherewhero, who says, "Mā ko anō tōku nei whare, ko te tāhu hu he hino, ko ngā paupau he mahue, he patati." They're saying that my house will be rebuilt. I'm going to use hino, my main post. Then you've got mahue and patati, my side posts. We already know that those are not the kauri or the totara. Those are not the rangatira trees. These are the common, resilient trees that you can find in abundance in the forest. So I take it to mean another thing. My world will be rebuilt, not by the leaders or the aristocrats or the politicians or the head of states, but by the power of the common people. So it talks about our humanity beyond our ethnic identity, beyond our position, beyond our status, is common ground where we can collaborate in meaningful ways. It also recognises this: it is the people who are at the grassroots level who make the most significant difference. If there's one recommendation I will give about this, these models and these exercises, it's this: these exercises are transferable across Indigenous cultures. I just come back from South America. Me and some of the whānau were over there sharing at the Whipsy conference, and I tell you what, I heard the same stories. Different language, same stories. Nō reira, i te whānau, ka mutu te kōrero i tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, kia ora wata.